Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. Now, I'm very pleased today to say I have a returning visitor. So for those of you that have been with CFO 4.0 from the start, you will remember Ian Stewart, who is the chief economist at Deloitte. And he's one of the key, I'm not sure the word founder is the right word, Ian, but one of the key architects of the CFO survey that they do quarterly. So welcome, Ian. Thank you so much for joining me on today's show.
Well, thanks for having me along. Actually, founder sounds terribly grand. I mean, I just say I set it up 12 years ago, and 12 years later, I'm still stuck running this server.
So I think founder is the right word. So founder and definitely responsible for this.
Yeah, responsible is probably the right word.
Brilliant. So for those that perhaps haven't listened to the previous episodes or haven't come across your report before, can you just tell us a little bit about it and what you've discovered over the years?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, I came to Deloitte from working in a bank, an investment bank, about 12 years ago. And one of the things that struck me was that in terms of the understanding of the economy, there was a huge amount of information about financial markets and a lot of information about things like consumer spending or manufacturing production, inflation. But a kind of key player in the economy were the people in organizations, in companies, who actually allocated capital and made financial decisions. So the CFOs, and that understanding what they felt about their own balance sheets, about their appetite for risk, about how they saw the outside world and the opportunities for their business would actually significantly add to the understanding of the economy. So my feeling was that CFOs are very important players. So we set the survey up 12 years ago before the financial crisis. We run it quarterly. We survey very large companies. I mean, they're companies mainly in the FTSE 100 or the kind of non-quoted equivalent companies in terms of turnover. So they're large companies. And it's a cross-section of the UK economy. Many of them are big exporters. On average, the companies in our survey derive actually more than half of their income from outside the UK. And what we're trying to understand is really the kind of balance sheet attitudes of corporate Britain, by which we mean the willingness to spend money, to invest, to do M&A, the extent to which companies want to raise or lower debt, their tolerance for risk, essentially how everything that's going on in their sector, their markets, and the economy is influencing their behaviour, and actually how their behaviour in turn will influence the economy, because the CFOs that we're talking to, they account for, on average, about maybe 20% of the entire UK equity market. So they're big players. So their decisions on investment, on hiring, on what they want to do have a big effect on the economy. So we felt that this was an important ground to understand. And actually, we've been very struck through the years how the survey has kind of tracked the ups and downs of what CFOs are doing. Through the financial crisis, the Euro crisis, Brexit, it's almost provided a sort of heartbeat of the corporate sector. And I think the other thing that I think has worked well is that it's been a source of interest to policymakers themselves. So to the Bank of England and the Treasury, we include questions from the Bank of England in the survey. They often reference the survey in, for instance, the monetary policy report or the minutes of the Bank of England meeting. And similarly, the Treasury, we talk them through the results of the survey. And it's also used by other people. So for me, I think I'm quite pleased the way it goes. I mean, actually, but above all, it's become a benchmark for chief financial officers themselves. As they're thinking about the environment, it gives them a useful yardstick for thinking about, the way in which their own peers are thinking.
It's always interesting, isn't it? Because I think that's one of the challenges, particularly in the world of CFOs, is there's not a huge amount of networking that goes on and a lot of discussion. And benchmarks can sometimes be very, very hard to find. So obviously this is a quarterly survey. When was the last survey released, and what's the current cadence?
Well, the last survey came out in July, and we will send the next survey out in early September, which will be published in early October. And I think the really striking thing about the survey that came out in early July was that we found that the CFOs we surveyed expected there to be a recession. So this was about 2 months before the Bank of England told us that they were now forecasting a recession. So CFOs locked onto this really very early. And it also showed the ways in which CFOs are seeking to cope with higher inflation, in a more challenging economic environment. So, I think it was the 50th survey we've run. There are some surveys which are very, very striking. This was one of them because I think it was a very clear sign of a big shift in thinking, really in the space of about 6 months. At the end of last year, CFOs were really quite upbeat coming into 2022, and that has turned around in a big way.
And it's quite interesting to hear your comments around the recession. So can you put any context around that? Was it just generally we think we're going to have a recession? Or was it recession within the year? What was the context?
Yes, exactly. It's a very good question. So we said what probability do you assign to there being a UK recession within the next 18 months? So by the end of 2023. And the weighted probability across the entire sample was 63%. And this was at a time when I think if you asked a lot of economists, they'd say maybe 30%, maybe 40% chance of recession. But I mean, it was a strong finding that the corporate sector themselves were telling us from what they were seeing, they thought it was likely there would be a recession.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and quite interesting that you've got that insight almost prior to the Bank of England even commenting on it as well. So it just shows the value of the insights into that corporate decision making process, isn't it?
I think so, and I think, of course, CFOs are at the kind of nexus of a series of forces in the economy: the effect of supply chain disruption, soaring energy prices, very tight labour markets. And of course, rising interest rates, and they're also looking at what's happening. They're very kind of well networked internationally, so they are looking at what's happening around the world. In many cases, they're selling or sourcing overseas, or they have affiliates overseas. So I think it's one of the features of the UK corporate sector. Large corporates is they tend to be quite internationally diversified. So I think. For me, it kind of reinforces this point about these are people who's are, kind of worth talking to because they make important decisions, but also they have a very strong, kind of good information set. So I think, this was at a time when I think all of us were thinking about all these forces. But what I found striking was that those, organizations which are having to work out what they're going to do were saying, well, actually, we think this will probably generate a recession.
And in terms of, obviously, that's a really interesting indicator, especially given all of the forward guidance we've got from the Bank of England. But you mentioned inflation. Now, I can only imagine that inflation was a high topic of conversation or risk that CFOs have identified. What was the commentary around that in particular?
Yes, I mean, their kind of view was that, the big problems facing the UK economy and their business over the next 12 months are inflation and rising interest rates. So those are big concerns. They've supplanted the pandemic, which of course was the big concern for 2 years. The pandemic itself supplanted Brexit, which was the number one concern for CFOs from the summer of 2016 till the spring of 2020. So, I mean, I think it was a very clear message that for corporates, inflation, arguably for the first time in maybe 30 years, was the number one risk, the number one problem for their business, because we've lived since the turn of the century in a period of generally very low and falling inflation and low interest rates. We asked CFOs also about what they expect to happen to inflation, and their expectation is on a 2-year view that inflation will fall and that supply chain and recruitment problems will reduce. Nonetheless, they do expect supply chain problems and recruitment difficulties to remain quite sort of prominent issues over the next couple of years. So I think what we're seeing is an expectation that a slowing economy is going to solve some of these problems of a tight labour market and supply difficulties, but won't necessarily solve them. And in the meantime, crucially, they think a recession will be the price we pay in order to get inflation back to kind of levels that we, until about 2 years ago, were considered normal.
So you mentioned right at the beginning of this podcast, talking to CFOs about how they're planning on coping with the challenge that is posed by inflation. Was there any commentary around that, or what kind of questions did you ask around how they're going to manage that?
Yes, it's really interesting. So we asked them what strategies they're using to deal with high inflation. And the top strategies are basically cost reduction, so improving the efficiency of the business, building up the resilience of business by building up cash in the business, and also by, to the extent they can, by passing on prices when they can. And of course, that depends very much on the sector and the product or service. And I think it also changes over time. So the ability of consumers, or the willingness of consumers, for instance, to tolerate price rises, I think is likely to decline, the longer inflation remains high. But those were the top three strategies. And what we also saw was we asked a whole series of questions, which essentially distinguish business strategies into defensive strategies like cutting costs or reducing debt, or expansionary strategies. So that might be introducing new products or investing. And what we found was that, I think, as you would expect, there's been a tilt towards being more defensive, bigger focus on cost control, a bigger focus on building up cash. But I think what struck me, to your point about how are they coping, there has not been a wholesale withdrawal from expansion. So actually, there's a continued degree of optimism about investment, about growth. The readings on the growth strategies are nowhere near as weak as they were, for instance, in the middle of 2020 or in 2008-9. And what I think, one of the, I think, sort of huge challenges for businesses are how you simultaneously deal with these, really immense pressures right now, as well as keeping an eye on the long-term outlook for the business, and can you reconcile what you need to do in the short term with, if you can, preparing the business for better times ahead. I mean, this downturn, like all downturns, won't last forever. And what we did see in the survey was that there was continuing really quite a high degree of optimism about investment in people, in skills, and in all things digital and technology related over the next 3 years. So I think in what clearly is a very difficult situation. I found that very interesting, that we haven't seen a complete pivot towards battening down hatches, cost control, avoiding risk. There is at this stage, it's more nuanced than that.
It's interesting, isn't it? I do wonder whether those CFOs have looked back on what's happened with COVID and gone, if we'd made different decisions at the beginning of COVID, would we be in a better position now? Or do you have any insight as to where that is coming from? And is it the length that they think that recession piece is going to hit?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting observation of yours about, lessons from COVID. I mean, the last, 15 years have obviously been an incredibly volatile time for the economy. We're now looking at our third recession in just over 12 years, and so been some very big ups and downs. And I think that most CFOs have been through a lot of volatility, and clearly, most recently, the biggest recession in 300 years, 2 years ago. And clearly, in some sectors, they've come out with shortages of capacity, which are kind of, you can understand why, but they are constrained because of decisions, probably necessary decisions that were made during the pandemic. And I think the other thing that I saw during the pandemic amongst clients was that I think there was an awareness that there was a question of companies doing the right thing by their customers and by their people, and the importance in really extreme times of keeping sight of those responsibilities and how the business would be viewed in the long term. We know that obviously during the financial crisis, some institutions, financial sector, came out of it with reputations, somewhat tarnished by events. So I think, my feeling is that the kind of essence of running a business in the kind of world we live in, which is becoming, it's much more uncertain than the world was in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Is that you have to be able to, I know we all say these are exceptional times, unparalleled, unprecedented, but in a funny sort of way, these unprecedented events are becoming the norm. So you'd say, well, actually inflation at this level we haven't seen in the States in 40 years, not unprecedented, but exceptional, and almost unimaginable as recently as a year ago. Brexit, similarly, Donald Trump, a systemic meltdown in the financial system. So I guess what I'm saying is that people running businesses have got to be able to deal with these things, and they've got to, they are part of the landscape. And, the interesting thing is that, although the economy and the corporate sector has been hit by a lot of very big shocks, unexpected shocks, of course, it has, if you think of the state of the economy at the end of last year, we had very low unemployment. We'd had a strong rebound from the pandemic. Balance sheets were in pretty good shape, and we hadn't seen a huge amount of destruction in the corporate sector in terms of insolvencies. So, I think at the moment there's a big focus on everything that's wrong with the UK economy, and a lot of unfavourable comparisons. Some of them justified, maybe between the UK and other countries. I do think that given the challenges this economy is facing, many European and US economies, the record is perhaps better than it might at first seem. So I think that partly reflects the fact that corporates have become accustomed to dealing with change and shocks. the invasion of Ukraine is again another, a full-scale war in Europe was not on anyone's list of risks a year ago, and it's had obviously huge implications for energy markets and prices.
I can only imagine the risk analysis documents that are now going to boards versus what they were 3 or 4 years ago. The extent, and I think what's really been really interesting the last couple of years, things that you wouldn't have even thought were possible or likely have now happened. And I find it fascinating to hear obviously what CFOs thinking. I like your thought about we're just getting used to it, getting very resilient in the corporate sector, and that all of these shocks are becoming the norm. And I'm actually quite interested because Brexit almost seems to have happened and nobody seems to be talking about it necessarily anymore. Is this something that has come up in your survey? Have you seen any re-emergence of the impact of Brexit, and particularly in line with inflation, or has it very much been left behind?
I think that what we saw was a dominant concern for the best part of 5 years. Once the pandemic hit and the UK had actually left, it dropped down the list of concerns. In the latest survey, actually, we've seen a rise in concern about Brexit. And I think that's probably to do with the Northern Ireland Protocol and the question of the status of Northern Ireland within the single market and within the United Kingdom, and the question of the resolution of the disagreement between the UK and the European Union. I think it also reflects concerns about the effect of Brexit on labour markets and labour supply. And inescapably, what we have seen since Brexit is greater costs and friction in trade, which impinges disproportionately on smaller businesses. And that's something which doesn't go away. It's a permanent change. I mean, we know that economic liberalisation, trade agreements tend to foster trade, and by extension, when you see an end to trade liberalisation, that is likely to kind of disrupt it. So I think what's happened is that, and I think this process will continue, that Brexit has, or the consequence of Brexit have become one of many issues that companies have to deal with. So I think that for 5 years we all talked about Brexit. I think it's going to become much more specific and sectoral in nature, and I think it was always the case that with something as vast and complex and uncertain as this, that the implications would come through over time and in all sorts of ways. And I think we're still seeing that process. I mean, there's the two most obvious effects of Brexit, I think, have been in terms of labour supply, where since after the referendum immediately there was a slowdown in European migration to the UK. And the second was in terms of investment. Investment ran a lot weaker than probably would have happened had the vote gone the other way. But I think now, what we're seeing is the whole series of changes, the practical effect of those on the corporate sector. But I think they become part of all of the factors which corporates have got to deal with, and clearly they are in some respects compounded by the pandemic and by what is happening in terms of the slowing economy.
And it's quite interesting. Obviously, we've had Brexit, we've then had the pandemic, and then we then had the war in Ukraine. How has that impacted on supply chains? Has there been a different? Are people looking to resource more locally? Has there been any were any questions around that in your survey out of interest?
Well, we also had supply chain problems and the duration and severity of those problems, which are seen as a severe problem at the moment, which will get better over the next couple of years, but won't disappear. I think just in terms of why supply chains, I think have come centre stage. I think there are sort of series of factors. One is that even before the pandemic, the growing rivalry between China and initially the US, but I think increasingly Europe too, meant that given the degree of interconnectedness between the West, broadly speaking, and China, that what it would mean would be that there would be a re-examination of some of those connections. And we saw it, for instance, in the debate when Theresa May was Prime Minister about Chinese investment in a new nuclear power station. Obviously, there was a discussion about Huawei and Huawei's role in the provision of new kit for the 5G network in the UK. And so I think that there was, China has, of course, the arrival of China in the global economy in the last 20 years has been one of the most titanic developments of the last 2 decades, and a very, very significant change in the global economy. And that integration of China into the global economy is predicated on a degree of kind of political concord between China and its markets in the West, and that is now being challenged. So I think that was one factor in terms of supply chains. I think the second factor was that the pandemic highlighted both the vulnerability of kind of previously hidden supply chains, how they could create vulnerabilities in economies which just took for granted the provision of plentiful, cheap PPE, for instance, protective equipment for the medical sector. But it also generated huge imbalances in supply and demand, which put immense pressure on supply chains, which had been optimized for very, very low stocks just in time. So there's a pandemic. And then, of course, as you say, Hannah, Ukraine, which has put further pressure on supply chains, both directly, how can Ukraine get grain to the rest of the world, but also indirectly through higher energy and transport costs, making these supply chains more expensive. So, I think you put the whole thing together, and I think what it says is this isn't the end of globalized supply chains, but I think it's prompting greater scrutiny of those supply chains and a greater focus on resilience as opposed to efficiency. And I think there's an interesting analogy perhaps with the financial system where one of the lessons with the financial crisis was that regulators decided they wanted to contain risk in the financial sector more. So in the light of it, they required banks to run high levels of capital. They were more strictly regulated. And that's created a banking sector or a financial sector which is more resilient. And I hope that out of the events of recent years, we may get to a world where we have supply chains which are also more resilient and more able to cope with shocks. Just one final point. We've got to be very careful of overdoing the pessimism about supply chains. I think the wonder about modern supply chains is they were never constructed for a world in which much of the West would close down for weeks on end. They were not constructed for a world of 20% contractions in GDP. And although they faltered, most key infrastructure kept running, and I think that is quite impressive.
I have to say, I think if anyone had looked back on all of the shocks, I think the economy has received in the last, even the last sort of 5 years, you would go, would we even have economy out of the other side of it with all of these things that are happening? But it is surprising. I think, sometimes you can, like you say, be too pessimistic about what is happening. And actually, it is amazing when I speak to CFOs, when we have conversations, how they all have a plan. They yes. might be, they might be aware of risk and identifying risk, but they have a plan to move forward. And, the conversation is still about growth, which I find really interesting, even in this challenging time.
I think that's right, and I think Hannah, that although of course I think economics is the most important thing in the world, I think the reality is that if you're running a business, economics is a backdrop. It's an important part of the story, and it becomes more important when things are going wrong. But the question all businesses face is, what decisions do they make? And there's an awful lot which lies outside the sphere of macroeconomics. It depends an awful lot on your sector, the decisions you make, your markets. And I think what I've seen is that companies have a high degree of agency. There are a lot of choices they can make, and I think that they've probably got better at making those choices in times of extreme kind of movements in the economy or in geopolitics, because over time they've been exposed to all the sort of shocks that we've been talking about. Clearly inflation is a different shock. This generation of CFOs, probably few of them went through the inflation, or certainly weren't in the roles, kind of seniority roles that they are now, in the early 90s when we last saw a recession, which is essentially generated by high inflation. But in a sense, we've got a generation of CFOs and leaders of business who have been through, in the last 15, 20 years, most extraordinary volatility.
Yeah, there is something, isn't there, about the skills that, having experienced that volatility, that you gain, and the ability that you have to manage it as well. But like you say, creates a sense of norm. Volatility is now norm, which is an interesting piece, isn't it? And I do wonder what will happen in terms of the education that comes out of this, and the obviously the skills that these current CFOs are gaining right now is incredibly valuable. But what does, if this continues, what does that mean for the training and the education of CFOs moving forwards? They have to be able to come into this and understand it and deal with it.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, Hannah, and I think that it's a bit like it's always said that generals study the lessons of every conflict. And I think that, for some extent, it's the same for CFOs. You've got to sort of, draw conclusions about, one's experiences through the cycle. And I think that there are kind of a couple of obvious ones to me. One is, a kind of premium on versatility and speed of response and flexibility. Now, look, nobody is ever going to say those things are bad, but I think that it kind of means that you've got to be able to change tack. You've got to be willing to change tack and make decisions quite quickly and respond. I tell you, I saw that in our own business in Deloitte. With the invasion of Ukraine, we had to think very quickly about the implications. For our clients, for our own business, how we communicated, what decisions we made, and I think the other kind of obvious conclusion is that, as well as the sort of skills that you would traditionally associate with a finance director or a CFO, the sort of technical and communication skills, the kind of environment that we've experienced in recent years. And I think the growing prominence of the finance function within organizations means the CFO has to be somebody who can explain to an organization the impact of external events on the business. And that means having a kind of wider view about, well, what on earth does Ukraine mean to us? What does, if inflation gets to 18%, as Citibank has recently suggested, how would that affect our business? So it speaks to a kind of breadth and a creativity and an ability to kind of take these external events and then process them and say, well, here's how we should think about them. So I think in the kind of CFO academies and the training courses of the future, those two things are they will be important areas to develop.
I think and it's interesting, isn't it? Individuals like you and your CFO survey are actually become more and more important because, like you say, being able to pull out and understand, the economics, the impact of policy changes, all that side of things, that's an interesting education piece, isn't it, in terms of how they apply, and like you say, how they apply that internally and how they explain that.
I think it's it's almost like the CFO is the person who's having to keep an eye on the weather forecasts and the weather, and interpret it. And of course, weather forecasts aren't always right. And you say that in spades about economists' forecasts, the economy, they're never right. But more importantly, they have to draw conclusions about what it means for your own business. They have to make that connection. So the role is not just sort of commenting. I mean, I have the luxury of just commenting on the economy, but it is the implications and the decisions that you draw from it. And I think, it means that you have to go beyond the specialism. You have to be willing to, push yourself in terms of thinking and researching, the impacts of these factors. Because I mean, time and again, I see it is the CFO around the table, to whom the board or the exec turn when external events, shocks come. Tell us what you think this means.
Yeah, absolutely, and I can imagine economics is becoming more of a staple in the CFO education, syllabus than we might think. Well, at least I hope it is.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Actually, we do find that we as economists, it's often CFOs who are interested in talking to us precisely because I think they have a lot in common with some organisations have heads of strategy who are thinking about business strategy, and I think that discipline coupled with the CFO's kind of very broad view and the financial understanding, those are two very important areas in this kind of environment. But yeah, I mean, I think the corollary of the remarkable stability of the global economy and the reduction in risk that we saw in the 1990s and early 2000s, and it was associated with much lower inflation, with relatively low and stable interest rates and quite good growth. So, with hindsight, it was a golden era. But actually, what I also saw as an economist myself working in the city was that economics became less and less important to companies because they could say, well, look, the world is more predictable. Do we really need to spend a lot of time thinking about whether growth might be, 2.3 or 3.1? And I think the implication of that is the sort of uncertainty now means that economics becomes a lot of stuff that would almost have been confined to economics textbooks and history, like how do you survive in an inflationary environment, or what does protectionism mean, or how do you deal with a situation where there is a chronic mismatch between supply and demand. Those have become real life issues and decisions for corporates. They're not just the preserve arid discussions amongst academic economists.
Yeah, and I guess it's in some ways it's an exciting but challenging time to be an economist because you have all of these things happening. The crazy events that you might model in conversations academically are now actually hitting the real world economy. So it must be an incredibly interesting time from your side of the fence.
Yes, I mean it's it is, and I think the challenge is always to try as best as we can to understand things and then to work out how the right decisions can be made by policymakers, by households, by corporates to deal with these sort of situations. And so obviously the economics is very, very important, but it is always the question of how can the economy adapt? How can we get better at dealing with it? At the moment, of course, there's a huge question about what the government might do to support households in the face of rising energy prices. And I think that, corporates will be having the same discussions. Boards will be discussing, thinking about how do we manage, the series of challenges. So, it is all about the actions. And I think it's also believing that there are things that you can do to make a difference, that we're not just passive viewers of the economic environment. There are ways of navigating these challenges.
Brilliant. Well, I'm very much realizing that I'm getting to the end of my time. And as always, I could pick your brains for hours. I promise I won't, Ian. But so in terms of this last report, were there any other interesting findings you just want to sort of bring out and sort of pull out for our listeners?
Well, I think the sort of, we've touched on this, but the sort of striking thing to me that I think the report highlights is this question of how, people in business, CFOs, kind of take on board, a whole set of bad news, frankly, and kind of steer their business whilst keeping focused on the, kind of long-term health and structure and prospects of the firm. And I think that the survey really highlighted that. On the one hand, the expectations of a recession; on the other hand, a kind of confidence about technology and investment and skills in the longer term. So I think that, for me, was perhaps the big story, because I don't think there's any doubt. We're seeing an awful lot of it at the moment. There's going to be a lot of challenge to come, and I think we've got to retain that longer term and more perhaps positive view in the same way we did, through 2020.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's I think it's great to hear that people are thinking about, the investment in, like you say, cost reduction, but in a maybe more productivity focused, and actually building a stronger business that can withstand some of the shocks that are coming its way, versus just simply cutting costs for the sake of it. So I think that's a really great insight. So thank you so much, Ian. For those that are listening, I will of course put a link to where you can download and access the report. Ian, are there any other resources or bits and pieces you want to shout out in terms of, for those that are interested in exploring?
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, I know I'm not supposed to advertise anything, Hannah, but but actually we do write a weekly email called the Monday Briefing, and it's on all sorts of things: inflation, cost of living, globalization, trade. It's designed really with a business audience in mind, and to our point in the discussion, Hannah, about how do you stay abreast of things. We are trying to provide information to people who are running businesses about the economic environment in a way that's useful. So, please, anyone's very welcome to subscribe. It's just Google Deloitte Monday Briefing and you can sign up if useful. We also have something called the Deloitte Economics Monitor, which again you can Google, but it's a rich store of charts that give you a constantly updated picture of what's going on across the economy. So again, the sort of thing you may want to bookmark, just so that, if you're wondering what's going on, you can look at a whole load of charts. Economists love charts. They're so easy to sort of scan through, and it gives you it really does give you a kind of map of the state of the economy. So, the Monday Briefing, the Deloitte Economics Monitor, maybe of interest to some of your viewers and listeners.
Well, I know the Monday briefing definitely is, because I was actually chatting to CFO about it a few months back. So for anyone that hasn't joined that briefing, absolutely, a really good read. And I will make sure we put the links into both of those things as well. So check out the show notes, guys. We'll have the links to both of those in. So and I can recommend the Monday briefing. So that's a great shout. So thank you so much, Ian. Wonderful to have you back on. I'll do my very best, guys, to convince him to come back on and tell us about the next quarterly report, because I'm sure going into the potential recession, that could be a really interesting one as well. So thank you so much, Ian. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you on the show.
Thanks very much for having me, Hannah. I'll certainly look forward to coming back.